U.S. and NATO forces have begun withdrawing from Afghanistan. American intelligence agencies have been shocked by the rapid conquest made by the recently, quote-unquote, subdued Taliban. Some reports state that 75% of Afghanistan has already been taken back by the Taliban as of July 15, 2021. Before this, less than one-fifth of Afghanistan was held by the Taliban in exclusively rural mountainous areas. In an ironic twist, the final date of departure for the American troops was chosen as September 11, 2021, marking the 20-year anniversary of the attack that drew them into the United States' longest war. The irony was lost on President Biden.
Tuesday, April 29th. The streets of Saigon, usually jammed with traffic at the morning rush hour, are quiet. With communist forces only a few miles from the center of Saigon, the order to evacuate American nationals is given.
Perhaps a more suitable date would have been March 29, 2021, the 48th anniversary of the last U.S. combat troops to leave South Vietnam. Less than 2 years later, Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, fell to the communists, and the war in Vietnam was over. American intelligence agencies have placed the survival of the Afghan government at about 2 years after U.S. and NATO forces withdraw. That number has since been changed due to the Taliban's lightning speed retaking of Afghanistan to a shockingly potential 6 months. The Taliban is making rapid gains all over the country due to the Afghan lack of support in themselves. The Afghan government is notoriously corrupt, plagued with injustice. It's estimated that 40% of the over $2 trillion invested into Afghanistan has already gone into the pockets of corrupt Afghan officials. When the U.S. negotiated a withdrawal under President Trump, there was an agreement made between the USA and Taliban that U.S. and NATO forces would be completely out by May 2021. The agreement signed between the Taliban and USA, the Afghan government was not present for the negotiations, stipulated that all military forces of the United States, its allies and coalition partners, including all non-diplomatic civilian personnel, private security contractors, trainers, advisors, and supporting services personnel, would leave the country by May 2021, and in return, the Taliban would not attack American or NATO forces, a promise they have largely kept. The ceasefire did not include protection for the Afghan government forces. While the Americans and NATO withdrew, Afghan security forces frequently surrendered without a fight, leaving their Humvees and other American-supplied equipment to the Taliban. Local politicians and tribal elders negotiated a series of surrender agreements with government forces, often unpaid for months. These troops left convoys of armored vehicles and stockpiles of weaponry, including artillery pieces, mortars, and heavy machine guns, in exchange for Taliban guarantees of safe passage. The Taliban promised that Afghan troops who surrendered would be sent home, and those who renounced the Kabul government should continue to live their lives in liberated areas with confidence. The Afghan government forces felt betrayed by their former benefactor, the United States. Due to Afghanistan's complete need of U.S. financial support, many consider Afghanistan a client state of the U.S. During negotiations between the U.S. and Taliban, the government forces were not present. Part of the deal included 5,000 Taliban prisoners to be released, infuriating the Afghan government forces, who have stated, "We have made no commitment to free the 5,000 Taliban prisoners." On July 2, 2021, Germany and Italy withdrew their forces. On the same day, the Americans vacated Bagram airfield. Afghan officials complained that the Americans had left without notifying the new Afghan commander until more than 2 hours after abandoning the base. As a result, the base was ransacked by looters before they could take control of the airfield. Meanwhile, fighting raged between Taliban and government forces, with analysts from Al Jazeera saying the Taliban is at the door of Kabul. Tens of thousands of Afghans who helped the U.S. could now be in a very bad situation. The Biden administration considered slowing down their withdrawal after the alarming progress made by the Taliban in order to give the Afghani civilians who helped the U.S. a visa or time to escape. The Biden administration has not slowed down its withdrawal as of yet. President Joe Biden has reiterated that the U.S. would remain engaged in Afghanistan with humanitarian assistance. The U.S. also committed to spending $4.4 billion annually to fund Afghanistan security forces until 2024. Who are the Taliban? History of the Taliban. Before 1978, Afghanistan was a poor, peaceful, out-of-the-way country in a geopolitically hot area, sandwiched between the major powers, India, China, Iran, and the Soviet Union. Soviet-Afghan War. The United States and Soviet Union both vied for influence in Afghanistan during the Cold War by building Afghanistan's main highways, airports, and other vital infrastructure points, which were essential to development in the ruggedly mountainous, landlocked country of Afghanistan. Afghanistan received more Soviet aid than any other country. However, Afghanistan maintained good relations with both the United States and the Soviet Union in the Cold War. In 1978, Iran fell to an Islamic revolution. The Soviets were wary that their Central Asian, Muslim Turkic countries could follow Iran, leading to a domino effect of Islamic revolutions. Afghanistan in the 1970s was dealing with unrest, and the Soviets, seeking to prevent what happened in Iran, supported a communist faction, and in 1978, this faction seized the country in a bloodless coup. The Communist Party initiated various social and symbolic land distribution reforms that provoked strong opposition. Mistreatment by the politically oppressive new Communist Party led to the Civil War of 1979. The communist leader installed by the Soviets was a man named Taraki. He was assassinated in an internal coup. This led to the Soviet army invading the country in December 1979.
I come to you this evening to discuss the extremely important and rapidly changing circumstances in Southwest Asia. Massive Soviet military forces have invaded the small, non-aligned, sovereign nation of Afghanistan, which had hitherto not been an occupied satellite of the Soviet Union. 50,000 heavily armed Soviet troops have crossed the border and are now dispersed throughout Afghanistan, attempting to conquer the fiercely independent Muslim people of that country. Along with other countries, we will provide military equipment, food, and other assistance to help Pakistan defend its independence and its national security against a seriously increased threat it now faces from the north. History teaches perhaps very few clear lessons. But surely one such lesson, learned by the world at great cost, is that aggression, unopposed, becomes a contagious disease.
Leading the Soviets into the quagmire of proxy wars that so many powerful countries have fallen into. They entered Afghanistan with relative ease, took the major cities, and destroyed the insurgents that stayed in those cities. The insurgents simply retreated into the mountains that encompass Afghanistan and waged a guerrilla campaign. They formed a decentralized organization called the Mujahideen. The name Mujahideen means one who wages jihad in Arabic. The basic units of Mujahideen organization and action continued to reflect the highly decentralized nature of Afghan society and a strong loci of competing Mujahideen and Pashtun tribal groups, particularly in isolated areas among the mountains. Eventually, the 7 main Mujahideen parties allied as the political bloc called Islamic Unity of Afghanistan Mujahideen. However, the parties were not under a single command and had ideological differences, mirroring the tribal makeup of Afghanistan even to this day. The Mujahideen were ghost-like warriors who would fire on Soviet positions and then retreat into the many complex cave systems of Afghanistan. This frustrated the Soviets, who were unable to use their superior technology. They had no way of engaging the Mujahideen until they unleashed the MiL-24 Hind attack helicopter, an attack helicopter that was able to find and eliminate Mujahideen fighters, making them vulnerable even in their mountainous terrain. The war eventually turned in favor of the Soviets, who were making quick work of the Mujahideen. The insurgents virtually had no way to defend or combat the heavily armored gunships with RPGs and AKs. The USA was quietly watching the events that unfolded in Afghanistan, still with a chip on their shoulder for the embarrassment they suffered in the Vietnam War at the Soviets' expense. Then they initiated, codenamed Operation Cyclone. Operation Cyclone was one of the longest and most expensive covert operations the CIA had ever undertaken. More than $20 billion in U.S. funds was funneled into the country to train and arm Afghan resistance groups. The U.S. built Stinger anti-aircraft missiles supplied to the Mujahideen in very large numbers, beginning in 1986. These struck a decisive blow to the Soviets. The Stingers were also so renowned and deadly that in the 1990s, the United States conducted a buyback program to keep the unused missiles from falling into the hands of anti-American terrorists, an effort which was covertly renewed in the early 2000s. Once the Mujahideen got their Stingers, the gunships stood no chance. As the Soviet Union was entering its death throes, they decided they must put an end to the war in Afghanistan. Nobel Peace Prize winner Mikhail Gorbachev authorized the Soviet Union to win by any means necessary, and in 1986, the war entered a new stage. The Soviets devised a plan to break the will of the people and force the rural societies into the major cities like Kabul, Kandahar, and Jalalabad, which they controlled. The Soviets have been accused of genocide in Afghanistan. Up to 2 million Afghans were killed by the Soviet Union and their proxy allies. The Mujahideen were simply farmers, so it became difficult for the Soviets to distinguish farmer from fighter. In order to separate the Mujahideen from the local populations and eliminate their support, the Soviet army killed and drove off civilians and used scorched earth tactics to prevent their return. They used booby traps, mines, and chemical substances throughout the country. The Soviet army indiscriminately killed combatants and non-combatants to ensure submission by the local populations. Many rural provinces faced depopulation programs. Half of Afghanistan's 24,000 villages were destroyed by the end of the war. Rape and murder became common from the Soviets all over the country. Even the Soviet troops in the chaos suffered greatly. Many became addicted to opium, which grew all over the country. Today, Russia is the highest consumer of opium and heroin in the world. Rape became a weapon of war. Oftentimes, Soviet and Afghan government forces would take women and rape them. Women who were taken and raped by the Soviets were considered dishonored by their families if they returned home and could be discarded or killed in honor killings. Deserters from the Soviet army in 1984 also confirmed the atrocities by the Soviet troops on Afghan women and children, stating that Afghan women were being raped. The rape of Afghan women by the Soviet troops was common, and 11.8% of the Soviet war criminals in Afghanistan were convicted for the offense of rape. There was an outcry against the press in the Soviet Union for depicting the Russian war heroes as murderers, aggressors, rapists, and junkies. Landmines were scattered all over Afghanistan, which to this day has caused the harsh, mostly inarable land of Afghanistan to be even less productive. One of the particularly evil tactics employed by the Soviets was their use of teddy bear mines. These were mines they scattered throughout the villages, disguised as children's toys. It would attract children to them, and upon being picked up, they would explode. They didn't contain enough firepower to kill the children, only to maim them for life. A mass exodus of refugees arose, and exited any way possible. The majority of them ended up in Pakistan, who shares not only Afghanistan's largest ethnic group, the Pashtuns, but also the largest border. The numbers amounted to 6 million women and children. The lucky children, who didn't end up in atrocious refugee camps, would end up in Pakistani religious schools. There, they would be mentored by clerics, leading to a highly Islamic dogmatic religious community to form. As the war turned against the Soviets, eventually in 1988, they had to pull out, mirroring what the Americans had done in Vietnam and are doing today in Afghanistan, leaving the Afghan government weapons to defend themselves. These weapons would end up in the hands of the Mujahideen and tribal warlords, which would add fuel to the fire. The Afghan government fell in 1992. The Mujahideen took Kabul, but due to their disorganized nature and lack of leadership, they started coming to blows with one another over different ethnic groups and tribal warlords. Afghanistan turned into a decentralized state of warring tribal warlords. In the 90s, many of the Pakistani children would return to Afghanistan. Now as adults, they formed the Islamic militia known as the Taliban. Translated into English, the name Taliban means students. They were welcomed in Afghanistan because, as opposed to some of the brutal warlords who would rape, steal, and kill, the Taliban followed Sharia law. Sharia law is viewed by many Westerners as savage and barbaric. It is an Islamic law that prohibits usury, gambling, bribery, fraud, and stealing, among other things, considered haram in the Islamic religion. Many times victims would be stoned to death or have a hand cut off depending on the crime. It was welcomed, however, as the gangster warlords instituted their own arbitrary justice. The ISI, Inter-Services Intelligence, the Secret Service of Pakistan. The USA used the ISI to funnel weapons to the Mujahideen during the Soviet-Afghan War. Many of the children that escaped Afghanistan would become low-ranking officers in the ISI. Many of them were also tied by kinship, both being Pashtun. The ISI began funding the Taliban. The Taliban had taken over roughly 3/4 of Afghanistan by the late 90s and stabilized the region with their strict interpretation of Sharia law. However, the Taliban was never legitimized and only got recognition from 3 nations: Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and of course Pakistan. The Taliban never completely subdued Afghanistan. In a small fringe region of the north, an alliance formed of the remaining tribal warlords, called the Northern Alliance. The leader of this group was a man named Ahmed Shah Massoud. Massoud would be assassinated on September 9th, 2001, and the alliance was seen to be surely doomed. One of the militias formed during the Soviet-Afghan War was the Arab Afghani Al-Qaeda, founded in 1988 by Osama bin Laden, a rich Saudi Arabian who follows the Wahhabi sect of Islam. In 1998, the fringe Al-Qaeda declares war on the United States over the United States' capture and torture of 4 alleged terrorists with an associate organization. Al-Qaeda begins by bombing 2 U.S. embassy buildings in Africa, killing 200 people. The attacks brought Al-Qaeda and their leader, Osama bin Laden, to the attention of the U.S. public for the first time. The FBI placed bin Laden on its 10 most wanted fugitives list. Al-Qaeda seeks to remove all foreign influence from Muslim countries. They at this time were centrally organized, with Osama bin Laden giving the orders. They operated mostly with suicide bombings. Al-Qaeda members believe a Christian-Jewish alliance is conspiring to destroy Islam. As Salafist jihadists, members of Al-Qaeda believe that killing non-combatants is religiously sanctioned. Al-Qaeda also opposes what it regards as man-made laws and wants to replace them with the strict form of Sharia law. Al-Qaeda regards liberal Muslims, Shias and Sufis, and other sects as heretical, and its members and sympathizers have attacked their mosques and gatherings. Hey everyone, I just wanted to thank you for listening to the show. Also, I'm announcing today that I'm going to start giving extended episodes, unabridged episodes, for people who subscribe to my Patreon account. For just $2 a month, I'm going to give you the extra content that's in most of these episodes. I'm having a problem because I end up researching these episodes so much, but it's difficult, I see with the analytics, not that many people want to listen to an hour or an hour and a half episode. So what I decided to do, I'm going to start releasing episodes that are about 30 to 40 minutes. And then for the additional 30 to 40 minutes, you can go on my Patreon if you want to subscribe to me and support me. It's just $2. You can have access to those episodes. Also, you could check out the other tiers. There's a $5 tier. In that one, I give bonus content, stuff that I haven't released, some other stuff, and God tier. If you subscribe to God tier, I'll give you a shout out by name. For example, some of the content in this episode that I cut out was the history and culture of Afghanistan. I get into the first president, President Karzai, and his government, and then some news articles I read about Karzai's personality, as well as the Afghan papers. I have an extended version of the Afghan papers that we get into a lot of the interviews. It's pretty interesting. Thanks again, guys. On September 11th, 2001, 2 days after the assassination of Massoud, 19 Al-Qaeda terrorists, 15 of which were from Saudi Arabia, hijacked 4 commercial airliners in the United States. 1 plane attacked the Pentagon building, 1 crashed in Philadelphia, and 2 struck the World Trade Center. It brought the skyscrapers down, killing many. It remains the deadliest terrorist attack in human history. Almost 3,000 people lost their lives. President Bush gave an ultimatum to the Taliban in Afghanistan. Expel Al-Qaeda, turn over bin Laden, or we will crush you. October 6, 2001.
Good afternoon. On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against Al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. These carefully targeted actions are designed to disrupt the use of Afghanistan as a terrorist base of operations and to attack the military capability of the Taliban regime. More than 2 weeks ago, I gave Taliban leaders a series of clear and specific demands. Close terrorist training camps, hand over leaders of the Al-Qaeda network, and return all foreign nationals, including American citizens unjustly detained in your country. None of these demands were met. And now, the Taliban will pay a price.
The Taliban were sheltering Osama bin Laden during this time. Laden had supported the Mujahideen during the Soviet invasion and was familiar with Afghanistan. Bush demanded the Taliban turn him over, and they refused. Many political experts believe it was bin Laden's goal to lure the USA into Afghanistan, known as the Graveyard of Empires. The USA turned to their old ally Pakistan, who had been supporting the Taliban for years. An ultimatum was sent to the ISI, the Pakistani intelligence agency, who had become famous in the 80s as the organization the USA sent weapons to ship into Afghanistan and fund the Mujahideen, and later Taliban. The ultimatum stipulated that they must stop supporting the Taliban. The leader of the ISI, Mahmoud Ahmed, told the US they needed to consider the complex history of the situation. Richard Armitage, the US Secretary of State, bluntly replied, "No, the history begins today." Pakistan couldn't say no and formally renounced its support for the Taliban 4 days after 9/11. Now remember, the Taliban controlled about 3/4 of Afghanistan, but never completely subdued it. The Northern Alliance still controlled the remote Panjshir Valley, located in the northernmost mountainous regions of Afghanistan. The Northern Alliance was essentially a group of tribal warlords who put aside their differences to fight against the Taliban. The USA went to the Panjshir Valley to form an alliance with the Northern Alliance, offering them money and training and the future governance of Afghanistan when the fighting was finished. The USA formed a coalition with the Anglosphere countries, the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, sparking the War on Terror. The USA invades. The invasion is like a mirror of the Soviet invasion 20 years before. These Taliban fighters were the same Mujahideen who had experience fighting the Soviets. The USA quickly and swiftly conquers the major cities of Afghanistan, but many top Al-Qaeda, including Osama bin Laden, and Taliban commanders were nowhere to be seen. In Kunduz, in the north of the country, something called the Kunduz Airlift, or the Airlift of Evil, occurred, where hundreds of top commanders and members of the Taliban and their Pakistani advisors, many ISI agents and army personnel, were airlifted out of the city to Pakistan just before it fell. The USA and Pakistan both denied that the airlift took place. Donald Rumsfeld, U.S. Secretary of Defense, said on December 2nd that neither Pakistan nor any other country flew any planes into Afghanistan to evacuate anybody. The Taliban fighters had experience from fighting the Soviets. They didn't make the same mistake that Saddam Hussein had made 10 years prior when he tried to take on the might of the USA head-on. They retreated into the mountains to form guerrilla-style warfare. In a couple of months, the Taliban were out of power, and a new interim government formed, under a man named Hamid Karzai. Karzai comes from an aristocratic Afghan family. His uncle, for example, Habibullah Karzai, met with President John F. Kennedy in the 1960s for a special meeting. During the Soviet-Afghan War, he moved to Pakistan to work as a fundraiser for the anti-communist Mujahideen. When the Taliban emerged in the mid-90s, Karzai initially recognized them as the legitimate government because he thought that they would stop the brutal civil war that was occurring in Afghanistan. He was requested by the Taliban to serve as their ambassador, but he refused, telling friends that he felt Pakistan's ISI was wrongly using them. Karzai then wanted to represent the Taliban's government for the UN, but the Taliban leader did not trust Karzai due to him having many links with Westerners. He also visited the Western embassies, including the US Embassy in Islamabad, several times, talking with American diplomats, and attempted to gain American support for modern, educated Afghans to weaken the Taliban's views. Karzai's father was reportedly annoyed with him for not having clear-cut choices, wanting to be friends with everyone, something which would plague his presidency. In July 1999, Karzai's father, Abdul Ahad Karzai, was shot dead in the early morning while coming home from mosque in Quetta. Reports suggest that the Taliban carried out the assassination. Following this incident, Karzai decided to work closely with the Northern Alliance, which at this time was led by Massoud. In 2000 and 2001, he traveled to Europe and the United States to help gather support for the anti-Taliban movement. Massoud and Karzai warned the US government that the Taliban were connected with Al-Qaeda and that there was a plot for an imminent attack on the United States, but the United States didn't listen. As the US armed forces were preparing for a confrontation with the Taliban in September 2001, Karzai began urging NATO states to purge his country of Al-Qaeda. He said in a BBC interview, "These Arabs, together with their foreign supporters and the Taliban, destroyed miles and miles of homes and orchards and vineyards. They have killed Afghans. They have trained their guns on Afghan lives. We want them out." When the US invaded Afghanistan, Karzai and his group were in Pakistan. They decided to return to Afghanistan to fight the Taliban alongside the American and NATO forces. He told his forces, "We might be captured the moment we enter Afghanistan and be killed. We have a 60% chance of death and 40% chance to live and survive. Winning was no consideration. We could not even think of that. We got on 2 motorbikes, we drove into Afghanistan." In late 2001, Afghan's top political leaders met to form an interim administration and named Karzai chairman of a 29-member governing committee. The Loya Jirga, or Afghan Grand Assembly, in June 2002, appointed Karzai as interim president of the new position as president of the Afghan Transitional Administration. Former members of the Northern Alliance remained extremely influential, most notably Vice President Mohammad Fahim, who at one point before this had Karzai arrested. Karzai attempted to unify Afghanistan's ethnicities. He favored a dress that combined traditional designs of the various ethnicities, Pashtun-style long shirt and loose trousers, an outer robe popular among Tajiks and Uzbeks, and most distinctively, a karakul, a hat worn by Highlanders from the Valley of Panjshir. In 2002, designer Tom Ford, who worked at the time for Gucci, was quoted calling Karzai the most chic man in the world. Karzai, during the interim government, chose to work with the many warlords and tribal leaders all around the rural country of Afghanistan, to varying degrees of success, attempting to negotiate and form amicable alliances with them for the benefit of Afghanistan as a whole, instead of aggressively fighting them and risking another civil war. As said by his father, he was attempting to befriend everyone instead of choosing a side. His actual power was very limited. He was often described while as president as the mayor of Kabul. The US implemented a strategy, one that would come out years later to be completely inept. They planned to dump massive amounts of money into Afghanistan in an attempt to modernize it. One of the plans devised was one they stole from the Soviets. In order to modernize Afghanistan, they needed to link the major cities of it. Highway 1, also known as the Ring Road, was a highway the Soviets attempted to build in the 1960s. During the invasion 20 years later, it was completely destroyed. In 2002, only 50 kilometers of paved road remains in all of Afghanistan. The US and other countries pledged $1.5 billion to the rebuilding of the Ring Road. It would run in a circle of 3,200 kilometers, connecting Afghanistan's 4 largest cities: Kabul in the east, Kandahar in the south, Herat in the west, Mazar-e-Sharif in the north. In the beginning, everything was going well. The road was being successfully built. Karzai was working on uniting the many tribes of Afghanistan. His administration was working on a constitution. Until in 2003, when the United States invaded Iraq. With the US invasion, most skilled generals, soldiers, contractors, and diplomats were diverted to Iraq, and Afghanistan became second priority. Taliban forces, meanwhile, began regrouping inside Pakistan, while more coalition troops entered Afghanistan to help the rebuilding process. The Taliban began an insurgency to regain control of Afghanistan. The more troops the West sent, the more the Taliban seemed to grow. Work on the highway stalled. The United States, among others, began dumping billions of dollars into nation building, the building of Afghanistan. Due to the USA's dumping of money into Afghanistan, corruption became rampant throughout the newly formed country. There was so much money sent there, seemingly without an objective. Many programs were illogical, such as investing $28 million on forest camouflage uniforms. Only 2.1% of the country is covered in forests. or $34 million into a soybean product. Soybeans don't grow in Afghanistan, and Afghanis don't eat them. Remember, the Mujahideen and Taliban were essentially uneducated peasant farmers. NATO didn't know who to fight. The growing civilian casualty tolls caused unrest, and the public grew discontent, and an anti-Karzai riot took place in Kabul, which led in May 2006 to at least 7 people dead. In May 2007, after as many as 51 Afghan civilians were killed in a bombing, Karzai asserted that his government can no longer accept casualties caused by the US and NATO operations. Relations started to get tense between the benefactor and the beneficiary. The Taliban upped its attacks all over Afghanistan, making the situation seem impossible. Every year, the Taliban was getting more and more active and taking more land, and all the while, NATO forces were causing more civilian casualties, creating a toxic situation. Not only was NATO responsible for civilian casualties, starting in 2006, the Taliban increased their willingness to commit atrocities. The UN reported that 76% of civilian deaths in Afghanistan over the past year have been caused by the Taliban. The Soviets, compared to the Americans, were willing to use far more draconian measures to win the war, and they still lost. The Americans were learning what the Soviets had 20 years before them, that for every terrorist killed, another 5 would take its place. Things had darkened in the once hopeful nation of Afghanistan. In America, politicians kept lying and saying that the war was contained. We were making progress. But in reality, these were lies. The situation was deteriorating, with the Taliban taking more and more ground. In 2008, Obama took a new look at the situation in Afghanistan, with 30,000 sitting US troops. He started something referred to as the surge, sending an additional 90,000 troops. The Taliban only got stronger and upped their attacks. Taking advantage of the mountainous and rural terrain of Afghanistan, they focused on the Ring Highway, which obstructed the US's ability to manage the countryside and bring medical services around the country. The US, just like the Soviets, were stuck in the major cities, and without the ability to defend the countryside, the Taliban only grew in strength. Highway construction became extremely dangerous, and the construction companies had to begin hiring mercenary groups to keep them safe. This made it extremely expensive. All the Taliban had to do was to attack the highway, isolate a region, and then retreat back into the mountains. In 2011, Obama reneged and began bringing troops home, saying, "Our troops will assume support roles instead of combat." Another $1.5 billion was raised to build the ring road at this time, amounting to $3 billion to build it, and it was never completed. Capitalism failed to take place in Afghanistan. Private foreign investment remains extremely low. Due to the instability in the region, private companies don't want to invest in Afghanistan, leading to only governmental entities. Government aid lacks an incentive to create a profit. The massive amounts sent by the USA and other countries seem to end up in the pockets of corrupt officials, leading to more corruption and resentment among the Afghani populace. The Taliban became rich off of mineral exportation and the drug trade due to the lack of government control of the many regions of Afghanistan. The Karzai government made poppy growing illegal, but the Taliban used it for funding. They also were receiving money from abroad, including Pakistan and Iran. On May 2nd, 2011, Obama announced,
"Good evening. Tonight, I can report to the American people and to the world that the United States has conducted an operation that killed Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda, and a terrorist who's responsible for the murder of thousands of innocent men, women, and children."
Bin Laden was found at a compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan. The United States has always had a mixed relationship with Pakistan, a Cold War ally whose relationship has often been described as a roller coaster. The United States is one of the largest sources of direct foreign investment into Pakistan, and is one of Pakistan's largest export markets. However, the war on terror has led both sides to criticize each other for an inability to find common goals. American politicians had repeatedly accused Pakistan of harboring bin Laden and many Taliban leaders, while the lawmakers in the Pakistani parliament leveled serious accusations at the Americans, doing very little to control the porous eastern border of Afghanistan, where Pakistan's most wanted terrorist, Mullah Fazullah, and his organization were believed to be hiding. Furthermore, drone strikes by both nations, a friendly fire incident at Salalah, and the incident involving an arrest of a spy in Lahore further complicated relations. These issues sharply soured the public opinion in both nations, with public opinion of each nation ranking the other as one of the least favored countries in 2013. 59% of Pakistanis consider the United States to be an enemy, reduced from 74% in 2012. As the years continued in Afghanistan, with Osama bin Laden dead, president after president came and went, and the war never ended. From Bush to Obama to Trump, all presidents talked about leaving Afghanistan, but it never happened. It became a silent war, falling off the radar. Until December 9th, 2019, when the Washington Post released the Afghan Papers. The Afghan Papers are a series of documents. They include more than 2,000 pages of previously unpublished notes of interviews with people who played a direct role in the war, from generals and diplomats to aid workers and Afghan officials. The documents reveal that high-ranking officials were generally of the opinion that the war was unwinnable, but kept this hidden from the public. The documents were released after the Washington Post won a 3-year legal battle, citing the Freedom of Information Act. The Afghan Papers revealed the complete ineptitude present in the USA. They had no idea what they were doing. They had no idea who the enemy was. They failed completely in Afghanistan. The US and Afghan government would ally with some disgusting criminals in order to keep the peace. Many felt even the Taliban were preferable to these scum.
He was giggling, and he proceeded to relate to us that a mob had gotten out of control at the airport and had murdered the Minister of Civil Aviation. And he giggled while he related this. Much later, it emerged, I don't know if it was ever verified or not, it emerged that Fahim Khan himself had the minister killed. But I certainly came out of those opening months with the feeling that even by Afghan standards, I was in the presence of a totally evil person.
You know, the good thing about Fahim Khan is that he is dead.
Yeah, and I check about every other day, and as far as I know, he's still dead.
He was one of our closest allies during the war. Some warlords would have child sex slaves. Drug trafficking was common throughout the impoverished country. We entered Afghanistan to create an American style of life there. This would be equatable to Saudi Arabia trying to come to the US and enforce their culture on us. Most damning was the fact that every administration tried to pass the buck. We kept dumping more and more money into the country, and all we got for it was more corruption and the Taliban coming off as more just. In 2019, the Asia Foundation said that 85% of Afghanis have no sympathy for the Taliban. However, one Redditor put it differently. I am an Afghani, and I can speak for the region. The Taliban isn't good. We don't like them, but we want the USA out. When Saigon fell to the North Vietnamese, they renamed the city Ho Chi Minh after the former president of North Vietnam. Order slowly returned. Saigon had become swollen with an influx of people from the war. Many citizens were sent to re-education classes in order to regain full standing in society. Between 200,000 and 300,000 South Vietnamese went to these re-education camps, where many endured torture, starvation, and disease, while they were forced to do hard labor. According to the Vietnamese government, within 2 years of the capture of the city, 1 million people had left Saigon to return to a life of rural subsistence farming. This is perhaps preferable to what happened when the Soviets pulled out of Afghanistan, when law and order completely eroded, and the warlords took over the country.